Hello, everyone. It's good to see you all. It's an incredible time. I feel like every single time I see people online, I'm like, it's an insane time we're in, but literally it's an insane time, right? I sort of have my screen off now, but I was sort of peering at the impeachment hearings. It's craziness. Okay, so I'm going to dive right in. I should say that when I share my screen, because I have a lot of information on my screen, I won't be able to see you guys. So if you have anything that you want to ask, shout it out, just because I can't see anyone. So if you raise your hand, I wouldn't be able to see you. Or you can just chat it in, and then I will I'll see it as it comes up. But also I'll make sure to have time at the end for questions. And I do want to make sure that this is helpful to folks. So I try to really kind of curate my selection of works and what I've done over the past several years and decade, really focusing on collaborations and broadly defined collaborations. So hopefully it's helpful for you all. I know that I think that there was a document shared with you guys that I created, which is really just kind of pulled from an assignment that I do with my students for the semester at Pratt, which is like a social justice praxis lab class, which is really the merging of art, practice, and theory, really. And so hopefully you all had a chance to look at that, as you sort of brainstorm with your students, recognizing that I know everyone is at a different place in terms of just like, what grade you teach, right? The level of perhaps social engagement. And so try to make it as sort of like broad as possible, but helpful to some of the questions that you could sort of ask and sort of germinate ideas with your students. And I know a lot of you all have that experience already. So I'm going to dive in. There's someone who's waiting to get in, I think.
Yep, got it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, cool. All right. Okay, so let me share my screen. Sorry, let me just, okay. All right. So some of this is going to just be a quick repeat, just as reminders of who I am. I might have started with this image last time we were together. And oh, Renee, if you can just let me know when it's, if you don't mind, like at 4:50, if you don't mind just letting me know when we reach that
No
time.
problem.
I also have my timer on, just because I can yap forever. And I want to hear from you all. So so about me, these are my multiple identities, artist, activist, educator. And I always like to start, my talks with sort of grounding myself in my family and community and the ancestors that came before me and continuing that work. So my grandmother was one of the folks that helped raise me. My parents were working really long hours, and my grandmother was the kick-ass like Shiro. So this is just a photo of us together. And, I think I mentioned in the last time, she really was my protector. Like literally people would sort of like bully me and she would just tell them to back off. So these are some a little bit about myself as a socially engaged artist. I use, photography and video and installation as the main approaches, infusing them in community settings as well as exhibition settings, but collaborating and co-authoring work with, people who are directly impacted by social injustice. And so, and before we kind of dive in too deeply, because a lot of my work is rooted around gentrification and housing rights, just to do a brief land acknowledgement, which is, as we know, the neighborhoods now known as New York City was home to the first Peoples Nations of the Lenape people, Algonquin people. Canarsie were the ethnic neighborhood for parts of Brooklyn where I grew up. We must pay respect to the Lenape people's past, present, and future, and their continuing presence and struggles in their homeland. No conversation about gentrification or displacement can be had without acknowledging that we stand and occupy Lenape land in New York City. I wanted to just rest on this quote for a second, because this will sort of set up my presentation. And this is sort of going back to Pablo Higuera's Education for Socially Engaged Art, which you all read some time ago now. But just to pull this piece out, and I just want to read a little bit, an excerpt from this first chapter. He talks, here he is talking about the definition of social practice and how that has evolved. And so he says, the uncomfortable position of socially engaged art identifies it as art, yet located between more conventional art forms and the related disciplines of sociology, politics, and the like is exactly the position it should inhabit. Socially engaged artists can and should challenge the art market in attempts to redefine the notion of authorship. But to do so, they must accept and affirm their existence in the realm of art as artist. And the artist as social practitioner must also make peace with the common accusation that he or she is not an artist, but an amateur anthropologist or sociologist. So he talks about how he sort of, how he prefers to use the socially engaged art definition, right, as opposed to just social practice, because we, a lot of us do sit in between, right, sort of the activism and the politics and the art engagement piece, art making. And so to sort of set up some of the work that I'll be sharing, I like to share this quote. And in the sort of spirit of interdisciplinary fields, Dr. Mindy Foley-Love, maybe some of you know who she is, but she's an African-American scholar who teaches at the New School. And this is a book she wrote about 20 years ago, but she looked at how urban renewal really uprooted, not only physically, but psychologically uprooted and separated African-American families in the 60s and 70s, right, due to urban renewal. She says that the place we call home is inscribed into our bodies. The streets we call ours is the setting for our communal longing and belonging. Our neighborhood is the first world we know as a child. And that really has stuck with me quite a bit, right? So it's not just the physical dislocation, but it's certainly the psychological one that scars you and that stays with you for a very long time in many ways. So the way I approach my work is really through my own personal lens and family narrative, but also acknowledging our collective community's history. And I don't just mean like Chinese American or Asian American, I mean sort of as a community at large, our history. So a lot of my work has more recently addressed issues of gentrification, but I've also made work around immigrant rights and labor rights, transgender equality, anti-militarism. But the focus of today will mainly be around housing work and my collaborations. So a mix of approach that I've used in social practice or socially engaged art has been, the common sort of installation, right? Like interactive multimedia platforms, collage, but also the more non-conventional ones, which are like sort of doing collective walks as a community and a guided walk, right? So that's more meditative. Augmented reality was incorporated into some of the walks that I did in a few of the projects, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And also just story circles, like storytelling and acknowledging people's stories and validating that as a part of this sort of larger social practice. And always being rooted in people's stories and humanity is really central to my work. So I'm gonna actually sort of pass by this really, I'm gonna look at these two definitions and you'll understand why I actually laid this out in the very beginning here. But it'll be quick. So creative placemaking, some of you may have heard of this term, especially as art teachers. So creative placemaking, right, has been around for about 15 years now. And it is sort of objectively a process where community development is leveraged, right? So the idea of beautifying a neighborhood, but using and leveraging public, private, and nonprofit money to change the character of a neighborhood. And often it's quote unquote to beautify a neighborhood, right? Using arts and local artists and cultural activities. Sometimes it's used to actually displace people, those very same people that you're supposed to be beautifying a neighborhood for. And that's why a lot of us, including the group Chinatown Art Brigade that I co-founded, which I will talk about, we've sort of recoined together this sort of a counter to that placemaking, which is placekeeping. And we describe it as the active care and maintenance of a place and a social fabric by people who live and work there. So it's not just about preserving the buildings, but keeping cultural memories associated with the location alive, right? So giving agency to the local people to maintain their way of life and to stay in their homes. And that's really, really critical. I will start off by talking about this piece of work that we did at the Brooklyn Museum with artists and activists, and then go into my own specific work. It's important to talk about this because I think this was a real turning point for many artists and activists who understood the power that arts and culture and cultural institutions can have in doing the right thing. So some of you may have heard about sort of this action. In 2015, the Brooklyn Museum, which sits in Crown Heights, was hosting the Brooklyn Real Estate Summit. These huge real estate heads, right, from all over New York, not just New York, but actually the US. And they were shutting down the museum to meet there. Brooklyn Museum is a public institution. They get public money, and people were outraged. This idea that you're gonna shut down this facility to do this real estate summit. Meanwhile, you know, they have moved away from their community roots, right? In the 90s and even the early 2000s, the museum was much more rooted in the community, which is situated and beyond that. And when they closed their museum down about, I guess, 12 or 13 years now, maybe more, they wanted to market themselves as the sort of a museum that was like sort of like a sort of world-class museum is what they called it, that they wanted to rebrand themselves as, right? No longer just a community-based kind of museum. And that's fine, but at the same time, they had all these exhibits, right? For instance, this one exhibit we're also protesting was, I mean, the exhibit that was in this museum during the protest was called Agitprop. And Agitprop, as you probably know, is the combination of art and activism, right? And so the 90% of the artists they highlighted were not people of color, right? Brooklyn is still largely people of color, and a lot of them were not New York-based issues that they were dealing with. So there were multiple issues we were dealing with, and I was a part of the team of activists and artists pushing for another piece in the museum, right? And so this group that we work with, Movement to Protect the People, Alicia Boyd, who is here on the second to right here, if you can see my cursor, maybe not, but second to right here. She's an amazing organizer in Lefferts Garden in Brooklyn, and has been organizing with homeowners and tenants in Crown Heights and Lefferts Garden to really not only fight against art washing institutions like the Brooklyn Museum, but fight the gentrification of these big developers, the city government and these developers who are gentrifying neighborhoods. Her house, for instance, is on a strip near Empire Boulevard. If you know the neighborhood anyway, the developers are trying to just crush out all these small little homes and build condos. And they've actually successfully, pushed back and fought back against that. And so it was really important for us to have our work kind of rooted in activism and working with folks who are directly impacted by not just the museum, but the forces of gentrification, what this was causing. And so we worked with them over a period of months to create this piece. And I should have showed you sort of the larger piece of where this is situated in the museum and the show, but it takes up a big part of the wall. And we fought for months for a piece that just reflected where people were coming from, right, in that neighborhood. And we negotiated with the CEO, the president of the museum. It took a while, and finally it came to fruition. And so this was a large piece that they had to shift around other pieces. This is part of, like I said, the Agitprop show. And we work with these activists from MTOP and other housing groups to identify the pieces they want to be on this piece, right? And we called it the People's Monument to Anti-Displacement. That's what they wanted to call it. And we wanted it to be, really a bulletin of sorts, right? People to find out information about what was happening and identify these systems. We worked together on this particular piece for a long time, which was like to identify the cogwheels of the machine: real estate, politicians, police to an extent, right? Who are they ultimately protecting in these newly gentrified neighborhoods? Even some nonprofits, right? And white folks, we say that they're a visual trigger of gentrification, but they're a much smaller cog in the machine, the larger machine of gentrification. Again, we call this the People's Monument to Anti-Displacement. And these were some of the, a lot of research was done together in a collaborative way. Like I said, we did this, in 3-4 months, which is actually a very short amount of time to do this, because we wanted to make sure it was up for a number of months in the museum. And so this is a quote from one of the leaders of the group, but we also wanted to show the facts, the hardcore facts. So rent burden, right? How, and as we know, rent burden is very high in New York City, right? Normally, we're supposed to be spending 30% of our income on rent. In New York City, it's more like 60% average. We've lost over 50% of people of color, now more in that neighborhood of Brooklyn, where has been traditionally Black American and Caribbean American. And of course, who our targets were, right? But also, is your community next? And what we found out from the security guards actually at the museum was that this was the most visited part of the museum, this wall. People would stay there, watch the video. Just to go back, this is a video here in the middle that I helped edit, which shows the police sort of brutality of these two Black activist women, older women, who were just there to challenge the rezoning. And they were really violently removed from the hearing. And so there was a petition people could sign. It was very much action oriented. So I'm just gonna kind of move on as a groundwork for some of the work to follow that I'll show. So this Place in Sunset Park is a project that has had many iterations, and it is an ongoing project. I started this in 2017. And it looks at urban gentrification and displacement on longtime immigrant residents, workers, and small businesses in the neighborhood that I grew up in. And I'm going to start by just showing you really 2 short clips, and then show you some images from the collaborations and from the exhibitions of this work. Okay. Sorry, give me 1 second. Can you hear it? Oh, I hope you can.
Yes.
Thank you.
嗰時都冇乜唐人㗎咋，嗰陣時咧係老番西班牙人多，咁啊我哋前面仲有個巴添，咁但係我哋為咗方便嗰啲細蚊仔翻學翻工咁啊買咗呢度，嗰陣時都未完全都唔知道咁旺發展得咁好㗎。
我咪好少中國人，好少啲中國人，即係間中啊見到有。
最係幾時開始有多啲中國人啊？
幾時開始？
至多3、4年啦，80、83、84嗰時候開始有嘅。
For the last 20 years, since the mid to late 90s, I've been obsessed with documenting the neighborhood that I grew up in, Sunset Park, Brooklyn, or how Chinese refer to it as Bataido, which means 8th Avenue in the Cantonese Chinese dialect. I'm not sure exactly why I had this obsession, but I did, and still do.
Even as early as I can remember, as a 13-year-old snapping photos in the neighborhood with my disposable camera, I photographed my family, friends, the kids and elders on the block. Later, when I was at NYU studying film, I shot hours of footage of my family.
I'm just gonna forward it a little bit to show one more minute and then I'll move on. Sorry, it's just a
Paper sign.
whoops.
Well, we're here today in one of Brooklyn's best-kept secrets, Sunset Park, a neighborhood where you can still get a spacious apartment with decent amenities at an affordable price while still having excellent transportation options and never being further than 25 minutes to Manhattan. It's a neighborhood known for its cultural diversity, its affordability, and its convenience. Sunset Park has some of the prettiest blocks in Brooklyn. Some of the streets are lined with brownstones that make you feel as if you're in the heart of Brooklyn Heights, only you're not even paying close to half the price that it costs to live there. There's also a lot of new development that the area has seen over the past few years.
Back in 2016, I started interviewing folks in the neighborhood, getting their perspectives on the gentrification happening in Sunset Park. I was interested in connecting people's stories of migration to the U.S., many of them finding a sense of home in Sunset Park, then being uprooted once again because of high rents and rapid gentrification. Tari Hum is one of those powerful voices. She grew up in Sunset Park and is one of the leading scholars researching and writing about the devastating effects of gentrification on longtime residents, workers, and businesses.
Sorry, let me just, okay. And then the other thing I wanted to share with you is just, and I'll put all these links in the on the chat, but these are some of the stories that I've collected over the years when the project was really got going in 2018, which was when the Sunset Park rezoning on the Industry City side, which is the sort of on the waterfront side, was getting really sort of impacted. So I wanted to also share, so I interviewed several teachers, and one of the teachers I interviewed, she was from a middle school in Sunset Park, and she talked about what she was seeing with her students. And I just thought Cecile Chong, some of you may know, she's I believe she's retired now, but this is 2 years ago when I interviewed her. Show a short clip. Whoops, come on.
2002, how it has changed, how I have noticed, is that when I started teaching here, there were a lot of kids that were from Puerto Rican families, from the Caribbean. And then little by little, that we started having more students from Central America, especially Mexico. And this year, things are shifting a little bit. I've noticed that we also have students from other Central American countries, also from Colombia, and we have more students from Ecuador. So seeing the changes of gentrification, I do see throughout the years that students mentioning, oh, we're moving, and then when asked, how come you're moving? It's the middle of the school year. And a few of them would reveal, it's like, oh, we cannot afford to pay rent anymore. Or a few of them would say, oh, we're moving to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is actually a very popular destination. And they would say, oh yeah, we're going to move with my aunt or with cousins or with family members that are already there. So we get that a lot. Other places is Staten Island that they moved to. Most recently, I had a boy whose family is actually considering moving to Texas, and that is new. And he did mention there's more room there, there are bigger the houses are bigger. So they're only 11 or 12, so I don't know if they understand the bigger picture. I see the changes through my students. It is painful when they have to move and you have the kids that you have grown attached to, and then in the middle of the year, they have to go. At one point, I had a studio in Industry City, like a block away from 36th Street train station, but actually that art foundation they moved farther in. I think they're now in the 40-something street.
Okay, so let me just go back to the PowerPoint. So this iteration of the project, and I'll say that it sort of evolved into a more personal project, but this version was a part of a show in 2018 at Open Source Gallery, which a lot of folks don't know this, but if you look at Sunset Park maps, actually Sunset Park, the edge of Sunset Park is 17th Street, and then the other edge is 61st Street. And so Open Source Gallery is actually, I guess it's the hipster term is, South Slope. What I basically did was transformed the gallery into a space where people's stories would come to life. So people could use their phone or tablet to bring to life the stories through augmented reality app. And so these were sort of, people could augment the pictures. And this was actually during the opening of the show. And you can see, there was actual video and, various stories being represented. These are just some of the photos that were on the walls and the videos. And then I had a research corner, and that was really important to me to include people's archives, like pictures that I had researched or people gave me. And also looking at the facts. People often say, well, you're getting emotional, like gentrification is just in your head. This is not really happening. And then you look at the data, right? And that's like telling a different story. So the pictures on the top left, as you can see in this archival box, are photos that a couple that moved to Sunset Park in the 70s. They were with the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, and they moved there to help start a chapter there. And they moved there obviously when there was like sort of devastation in the city, white flight, and all of that. And I have an interview with them, and they shared some of their archival material with me. And then an activist talk, which is really important to me. A lot of people who are in the videos and not in the videos, these are folks who live and organize in Sunset Park. It was very important to always have community programming as a part of any exhibition that I'm a part of. And then doing walks. So this is one of the placekeeping walks that I did with folks starting in Sunset Park, in the actual park, and then going to the 8th Avenue side, which is the Chinese part of where I grew up in Sunset Park. And people could use their phones actually there was actual map, right? An actual map on the newspaper. So people could use it on their own and do a self-guided tour, which some people did, or we could walk together and actually people could pull their phone up to the actual site and augment it. So it was also part of the BRIC Biennial in 2019, which was this particular aspect of the exhibition was the concept of home and the, sort of interpretation of home. And so these were flags that new iteration of this piece. I sort of created this window frame with pictures of my family in front of our house. And I realized that every year we would take, since I was little, pictures in front of our house in Sunset Park. And it's because my grandmother would send it back to family in Hong Kong and China, right? And to show, a slice of the quote unquote piece of the American pie, right? That we, back in the 70s when families were able to actually purchase property, right? And so these were some snapshots with family in front of our house that we took every year. So these are flags that hung these banners, and I'll show some close-ups here. These are just, those are obviously opaque banners, but this is just a representation of them, and basically looking at how neighborhoods were redlined. And as you probably know, redlining was something in the 30s, didn't get outlawed till the 60s, but it's still very relevant today, and it's still practiced unofficially, right? And so literally pulling out quotes from government agencies' own words, right? And Ta-Nehisi Coates' case for reparations, that article really had influence on me in terms of digging deeper, right, into redlining specifically. And the only neighborhood that was deemed safe and back in the 30s was Bay Ridge, was one of the only green parts of the neighborhood, right? So first grade meant, very safe. And then D, of course, meant dangerous, right? And what dangerous translated into was that there was a threat of infiltration of foreign-born, in their words, Negro or lower grade populations. And so that meant that green areas were green, not because of the quality of the buildings, but because, as Ta-Nehisi Coates reminds us, that they lacked a single foreigner or Negro. And so that's just language specifically from his article dissecting the redlining maps of that time. And again, this is still very relevant today, as we see throughout the country. And then the last iteration of this piece was recently at the Old Stone House in Park Slope, that I was fortunate to present this project. And then another thing that I want to point out is impact. And so I very, I think all of us here agree that art alone cannot save us, right? Art and culture has to be placed within a larger perspective, right? That if it's not a part of grassroots organizing efforts, like on the ground, people who are directly impacted organizing for change, then it's just, art for art's sake. And so that's really important to me, to just really state that. And so I say that because this image is just one of the places where I was invited to present the project, the different stories. And the community board, as you know, probably they are the ones who can actually, the community board, as well as the council members on the local level, can vote no on rezoning, right, on gentrifying a neighborhood. So I was invited in different spaces to present this work to community board members and elected officials. And then it was defeated, right? So in 2020, in September, as we all know, with lockdown, Industry City thought they could do this with flying, at neck breaking speed, right? They thought, oh, we'll do it on Zoom and we'll be able to pass this with flying colors. And in fact, the hearing was 12 hours long on Zoom. People flooded the Zoom line. These are folks who were outside protesting as they were calling into Zoom, which was really meta, right in front of Industry City. And as a result, elected official also, Councilmember Machaca, had also denounced the rezoning and opposed it. He was first kind of for it, but then he opposed it. He knew the community was not backing it. And then it was a huge defeat, right? Their promised $20,000 jobs was all dissected, right? All of this, this is just a headline from New York Times, but it was defeated, right? In short, this sort of culmination of organizing efforts. And not to, and I just want to point this out because I think that, art and culture, when done right, when it's highlighting the work of people who are directly doing this work, I think that's important to kind of highlight some of these victories. And so this project about displacement got really sort of personal for me during the pandemic when we're all in lockdown. So this project, I'm going to move through it fairly quickly. It's called Intimate Distant. Basically, you could see my mom and dad here. Just looking at how this project really looks at how displacement has impacted my family very personally, but also using this time to probe into using this time right now of COVID as a portal to look at my family's journey, beginning with the early days of the Chinese Exclusion Act to the current pandemic. And I say that because I, only realized in the last couple of years that I had family that sort of 4 generations of family members who were in the US. But because of the Exclusion Act, many of them couldn't stay. My great-grandfather, for instance, their Chinatown was literally chased away by white laborers. I would call them rioters and murderers, basically. And some people were killed in these riots, these insurrections by, sounds very familiar these days, right? By white insurrectionists who didn't want any Chinatown in their neighborhood. And so looking at the past and the present, So these are just photos of my family in in the apartment and in the house. And as you can see, it's still very much the way it was from when my parents purchased it in the 70s. And so they're living on fixed incomes, former garment workers. And I was also looking at their relationship with one another, because economic strains have played a huge role in their relationship and the strain in the relationship. So you can see in this picture these condos that have gone up. So this was taken up 2 months before the shutdown, or 3 months maybe before the pandemic shutdown. But more condos have actually been built on this block that my parents are on since the pandemic. So this sort of misconception that everything is stopping, it's actually quite the opposite, especially with real estate in New York City. So I like to show this picture of my parents from 65 to 2020. For better or worse, they are together and figuring things out. These are stills from the project that I was mentioning, which is looking, like I said, like at my family and history of migration, many over 130 years ago to today, and the various kind of archives that I was able to piece together. And so the pandemic gave me time to actually dig much deeper into my own family roots and history. And so a lot of this produced during the pandemic was me really dissecting these archives and connecting the dots. And so those are just some frames from that. And then again, connecting more of the dots, doing collaging. And I have to say, during the pandemic, my work is very community-based, and no longer could I do that. So I had to really turn inward and figure some stuff out on my own. And a lot of that meant, looking at my archives and looking at the community, and then kind of reflecting it back on myself. This project is in Queens Museum currently, and I want to say that this is with 11 other artists, and it's about home, the sense of home, and it's 12 artists who are connected by this idea of home and shelter and mobility. What does that mean? And so this is on the 3rd floor of the museum, and this piece is called Resistance in Progress. And this is actually a close-up of the collage that I created. And basically it's a real estate magazine cutouts. It's just, a messy kind of collage of that I circled of different ads. And the average of the 6 magazines and different ads, the average price of a condo in Flushing, Queens, is about $950,000 for like a 1 to 2 bedroom condo. But meanwhile, the family of 4 average income is $41,000 right in this neighborhood. So clearly it's not meant for people who live and work in Flushing. And Flushing is diverse. It's Latino, it's Chinese, it's Korean, it's African-American, Indian. So it's clearly not for the people who are there. And so I call that speculating Flushing, because it's one of the fastest growing real estate industries in New York City. So the group that I work with was Min Kwan Center for Community Action out in Flushing, and they've worked on immigrant rights issues and housing issues, a lot of different issues. And so we work together. I create this community bulletin to put up sort of, it was a bulletin to make folks aware of actions that were happening, various ways they could take action just by their phone or contacting the organization. So these were videos. These were all videos, and there was a interactive timeline. And the Queens Museum gave it a boost, the whole exhibit really a boost, which is why the exhibit has been extended some extra, like an extra month. And this is an online resource that was created for each artist. And it's really important for me to, again, have this work grounded in empirical evidence. And so these 2 particular scholars who write about gentrification and Flushing and beyond, using actual empirical data of what is happening in the community. I'll just show this really short clip. I know I have 10 more minutes. I'll just show this really short clip from the show. This is a video in the show. Okay.
Flushing used to be affordable for immigrants to like stay. So a lot of like newly immigrated people who just settled in America, they were able to, rent a space or like get an apartment or like be a roommate and things like that. but it's not like it anymore. It's getting really priced out, and people are getting pushed, and I don't know where those immigrants would have to go. I'm an immigrant from Korea. Our family immigrated to Flushing, New York, about like 10 years ago. And then ever since that, I grew up here. We start life here, and then we're building our lives here.
I'm Bobby Nathan. I was born in Kingston, Jamaica. I came here at the age of 16. I've been living in Flushing for 38 years now. I grew up in Flushing. At the time, Flushing was predominantly white and Jewish. There were certain parts of it, like by the LIE, which was Italian. And it was a neighborhood that was changing slightly. A lot of Koreans were moving in, especially here on 41st. And so it was like a great neighborhood to live in. The businesses here were like diverse. In fact, we didn't even go into Manhattan. On rare occasions, we would go into Manhattan. We used to call it the city. And we would stay mostly, anything you wanted here, you could get here in Flushing. So we had like movie theaters. We had like 3 movie theaters downtown Flushing. We had like a lot of pizzeria, a lot of supermarkets, doctors, lawyers, everything you needed was here in downtown Flushing.
So I just wanted to share, and I'll again share all these links with you guys. And then I'll sort of, the last 7 or 8 minutes, I will talk about Chinatown Art Brigade, this cultural collective that I helped co-found in 2015. This is a quote that we like to always open up our presentations as Chinatown Art Brigade with, and it's quite simply, gentrification is the displacement and replacement of people for profit. Ultra Red in LA, who does a lot of work out in LA against gentrification and also other issues, we attribute, this one sentence to them, and we feel like it really kind of encapsulates it. So Chinatown Art Brigade, I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but we're a woman-led collective of artists, media makers, and activists who are committed to advancing social change. And for us, it's really central that it's really, important principle is that we feel a great sense of accountability to the communities that we collaborate with in the art making process, in the cultural production process. And our strategies have mainly focused on de-gentrification in Chinatown. But we've done a lot of solidarity work with other citywide efforts against displacement. And so this is some of us on a roof of one of the members who's a tenant in Chinatown. It's on the rooftop of their tenement building. And so our project began we started collaborating with CAB, Organizing Asian Communities. They have a Chinatown Tenants Union, and that started after 9/11. After 9/11, as you all know, Chinatown's very close to ground zero. Real estate developers started to use it as a way to, use the redevelopment or rebuilding as a way to push people out, longtime residents out. And so the Chinatown Tenants Union approached us about using art and culture to highlight people's stories. And so we did that in various ways. And we had been already, some of us who've co-founded the brigade had already been involved in different ways with the Chinatown Tenants Union and CAV. And so we started with story circles. And this is a picture of a story circle that we did. We did workshops. We did a whole intensive 8-week summer-long workshop where there were young and old tenants, a mix of monolingual Chinese speakers, bilingual speakers. When people share their stories, there was not a dry eye rather in the room. The question that people answered, we had 3 questions. One of them that most people answered was when describe a time that you felt a sense of disbelonging in your community. And almost everyone addressed that question, and people were talking about being dislocated from their home country in China or Malaysia, and then talking about being here in Chinatown and then having to move around maybe 3-4 times within a couple of years, right, because of rents. We did placekeeping walks. So these are just some stills from some walks that we did where tenant leaders and residents would lead us on walks, and we would map out the places of importance in Chinatown. We also had various activities that people could do. One of them was take a picture, a Polaroid, sketch, chalk. And so a lot of people, actually community members, started chalking because one elder tenant talked about this place on Delancey Street that's now a upscale gym. And it used to be a place where she was sewing garments. She was a garment worker for 20 years. And she says it's very painful for her to pass. She lives right in Chinatown. She never really passes this block because it's very painful. And after she shared that story, people felt the need to, they wanted to, you know, to write some slogans. And a lot of them say like, where, you know, where are the stores that used to be here? What, you know, who do you know who you displaced, that kind of thing. So these are just some of our community dinners back when we all could do things together without masks. So a lot of it was around community building. It was very important that we've built a foundation of trust with one another. So these were part of, so basically what evolved from these placekeeping walks and the mapping that we did of people's stories was images and slogans that we projected at night. And so we did several projections where we would project onto specific sites that the tenants wanted us to project on. And what was interesting was that they wanted to do this at different locations where they knew that because Chinatown residents work really long hours, they wanted to project this on places where people were coming up from the subway after work, right? So they could see this and connect with the messages. You know, on the left here, you said, you know, it says, who did you displace to live in your condo? This was actually in Chinese and English and Spanish. It did rotate. And on the right side, actually tenants rewrote a song, a Chinese song with lyrics that were anti-gentrification lyrics, and people sang them together. And random people came and sang, which was crazy. People who we didn't know actually joined in on the karaoke. And this was, I think, a moment that encapsulated for us, this tour bus that was going by. And there's something called the People's Pad where people could write their own messages and it would be projected large on this wall. Whoops, that's a double, sorry about that. And then people's stories, right? So we had people's stories that were projected. This was a location right across the street from a building that CAV was organizing, and there was lead in the building. And this one woman here on the left, Mrs. Wong, her family, she has 3 generations of her family, her children, and her grandkids as young as 5 or 6. And there was lead that the landlord was just completely ignoring. And so that's obviously very damaging for the kids, for everyone really. So she wanted her story to be shared so that residents in her building would be, you know, be curious about what was happening. So a number of them came out and started to also share their stories about the landlord. And this is that site. And then we did this animation on the same site, calling out the landlord. In this case, R.A. Cohen was the landlord of several properties in Chinatown. And this is the People's Pad in action. So people were writing messages of solidarity that were being projected onto the wall. Whoops, sorry about that. I don't know why that is in exclamation points like that. We also have done a lot of collaborations with groups like Decolonize This Place and calling out art institutions who have often been on the wrong side of the issue. And I'll just I want to just sort of pass through these really fast, just to say that we have collaborated with major institutions to use those platforms as a way to engage with people we normally wouldn't be able to engage with, and frankly, that tenants wouldn't be able to engage with, particularly artist institutions, large and small. And we've been able to have quite an impact. And I'll just say that when we did this programming at the Whitney Museum, we didn't realize, this is a couple years ago, that one of the pieces in the biennial a couple years ago was a painting of a disfigured Emmett Till. And Emmett Till, you probably all know the story of Emmett Till, who was brutally murdered by white supremacists in the 50s in the South. And this white woman who made this disfigured painting that was up for everyone to see was, folks were very offended, and it was just disgusting, disgusting to even have that as a part of this art exhibition. And so we completely subverted the whole thing. We were supposed to talk about gentrification, our own work. We used the whole session to highlight Black artists who are doing work around racial justice, Black Lives Matter. And also we Skyped in Drew B. Hill, who's a lawyer for the reopening of the Emmett Till case, because the woman who claimed that this 14-year-old boy whistled at her, which is just the fact that someone would be murdered for that, right? But anyway, this 83-year-old white woman now claimed that she admitted that she made it up. And so there's a reopening of that case. So that was like several years ago. So we've done things with Smithsonian pop-up shows. We did something with at Artist Space with Decolonize This Place. And to our surprise, a lot of galleries showed up here, commercial galleries who didn't maybe want it to be targeted, but they were like, hey, we're here for this conversation. How can we be more friendly to the community, right? And a few of them actually started a group called Art Against Displacement, which was really surprising to us that some of them actually wanted to be on the right side of history. And then the last thing I'll talk about is our AR project, right? So the AR project, very similar to the one in Sunset Park that I created. This was something collectively sort of crowdsourced, where people would give us photos from back in the 70s or 60s, what the building used to be. And in this case, this is a hotel, but back in the day, it used to be Music Palace. And this was one of the last theaters that played Hong Kong and Chinese movies. And it closed in 2000 to make way for this hotel. And on the side was a famous mural that Tamia Arai, one of our co-founders, created. That's no longer there. And so we had various iterations to actually do a test run with community members so they could see how it worked. And so we had these photos and people could augment them right through these devices. And you can see people kind of coming to this open studio that we did. And then these projections, which I actually, I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm just going to sort of go past this, but I'll put the link in. But this is just a video showing the projections, how the community responded to the projections. I just want to end off by this sort of, in the last couple of months, what Chinatown Art Brigade has been doing is actually joining in on the efforts to denounce new jails in New York City, and this one in Chinatown. This is the one here, you can see the rendering here on the right. In the back, because they claim that they're closing Rikers Island, they want to build 4 new jails in New York City, and one of them would be in Chinatown. And as if we needed more jails, or as if incarceration would be the answer, right? So we've been challenging this, and more specifically, we've been challenging the Museum of Chinese in America. They're a museum that's been around for about 35 years, and they claim to be for the community. And since Black Lives Matter uprisings, they claim to be allies to that movement. Yet they're taking $35 million in money from the city in return for giving their blessing to the jail, to incarcerating people, to putting people in cages. And so I wanted to sort of end on that. I'll just stop there. This is about an exhibit that I curated, but I'll put the link. I'll put the link in the chat. So I'll just stop there. Sorry, I know that was a lot, a lot of information, but I just want to stop there and make sure that there's time for discussion.
That's fantastic, Betty. You gave us a really good, rich sense of all of the different kinds of work that you do, which I think is going to be really wonderful for discussion. So let's open the floor for your comments and questions. I think what's kind of worked recently for us is to maybe go ahead and raise your little Zoom hand. Probably all of you remember how to raise your Zoom hand at this point. If you click on the participants icon down on your toolbar at the bottom, you'll see a screen pop up of participants, and there will be a raise your hand there. But if you have a follow-up question, then I'd encourage you just to unmute yourself and jump in so that we've got kind of a structure. So let's start anywhere with this discussion, with your questions about Betty's work, with your questions about the practices of activist art, whatever you'd like to start with.
Sorry, I'm just seeing the chat now, so I don't know if there were questions. It wasn't popping up for me before, so.
Oh, that's okay. Great, Jess, why don't you jump in?
Yes, thank you so much, Betty. I loved what you were saying at the beginning about being a caretaker. And I want to think about that in terms of art and society. So even during the pandemic, when so many of us are working at home with our children underfoot, we still want to hide that from people because we are taught to be workers who have separate family lives. And even now, I find that we're still trying to keep that a secret, even though we all have little ones running underfoot. Could you talk about just identity and why our society does that and how art might be able to address that?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a really interesting perspective to offer. Yeah, I guess for me, art has always been a way of healing and processing a lot of things. And so I say that because I grew up watching my mother juggle like 2 jobs, right? Literally working 14, 15 hours in a factory for less than minimum wage often. And then coming home and taking care of 4 children, cooking and cleaning. And I have to say, love my dad and everything, but he's just a product of the patriarchal society, right? He worked long hours as well, but my mother struggled so much just to put food on the table, just to just help us get by on a day-to-day level, both of them really. And then my grandmother really was the foundation to all of that. And so I would say that I think that the more that we can get, you know, and I don't want to gender things, but I think a lot of women have a very special perspective to offer in this work. And I find that I guess it's not an accident, but I was looking even at the photos of some of the collaborations. And a lot of the collaborations have been with female cisgender folks, because I think that we you know, I want to resist that caretaker gendered role, but I also think caretaker can mean so much more, right? And even when we're talking about placekeeping and what does it mean to be a caretaker of the community itself. And so in terms of the role of art and culture, I think that it's a matter of also shifting sort of the culture, right? To really to sort of destigmatize these roles that we are often boxed in, whether that be women or men in certain stereotypical roles, but also on the larger context, I think there's a lot of class and race and gender that are always really very, very much intertwined in this. Speaking for myself, I was always very ashamed growing up, coming from a low-income working class, I would say low-wage family, and my immigrant parents. I remember growing up, I would lie to my classmates about what they did, right? Like I didn't want to admit that they were garment workers. So it was a lot of that kind of stuff that was coming up for me. And so, you know, I think that they're very much intertwined with societal norms and how do we challenge those norms, not just around gender, but class and race in particular, because that has impacted my work a great deal. So I don't know if that answers your question, it's like a jumble of words, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fred, do you want to jump in?
Oh, sure. Thank you. Betty, thank you very, very much. I love this presentation. I saw that exhibit in one of the exhibits that you showed. I remember taking students there. And I think you know a friend. Do you know Joanne Lum by any chance?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah, she's a good friend of my wife's. Yeah,
oh, no kidding.
Wonderful. I've got to just say, I'm really, you know, inspired, and it has direct correlations to a lot of work I've been doing for many years. And it's a real way for me to level up a little bit for ways that I can work more into the community where I live in Washington Heights. My question to you is about, you know, this, and I'm really happy to get that we got this excerpt from the Elguera book, because I really appreciated his levels of involvement kind of thing, where there's like the passive audience, the directed involvement, and then more collaborative involvement. So I'm kind of been working in the space in the directive / collaborative. And I heard you say something about accountability to the community. So, you know, where I've been working, it's mostly in my school, although I've done quite a bit in the city and in my community also. There's this kind of like, there's a lot of assumptions, which also Helgera talks about who your audience is. So a lot of times, you know, my students, I kind of I know them for many years. and I know the neighborhood, so I can kind of assume things that they may or may not be interested in. That helps me when I'm developing projects, a lot of times with them, but other times I'll put something forward, and if it catches on, we do it. If it doesn't, I move on. But I'm kind of interested in trying to get deeper into collaboration. I have done some very collaborative things, but I'm interested what you would, how you would talk about your feelings of accountability and how that works when you're developing projects, or, you know, a lot of the ones that you specifically showed us, to what extent were they coming from the grassroots of the neighborhood and the people that you were working with? And to what extent are you directing, but in collaboration? And how do you see that as trying to go deeper? I guess that's what I'm interested in, is how to go deeper so it's more of a creative, self-directed, self meaning the whole community. And because I think that's where we get the most leverage against these huge projects that are multi-million-dollar enterprises.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. You know, I've entered it from both sides. One where the community has approached me or a group of us, and then, like you said, the other sort of the other side of it, which is I'm approaching community groups with an idea. So I will start with just an example from my work with Chinatown Art Brigade. And when we started, like I said, some of us co-founders were Tamia Rai, Mansi Kong, and myself were already involved in the community for many years in various issues. And, you know, one thing that, you know, one thing in it was 2014, 2015, when the rezoning in Chinatown, the towers in Two Bridges, if you know the water sort of,
yes,
what is it? Yeah, I forget the address. They've named it like South Street or Water Street. I don't even know what it's called now, but the three big, huge behemoth 80-story luxury towers that are going to be the tallest in the city. When that was coming to a head, CAV, Chinatown Tenants Union, came to us. And also I know Joanne's group and other groups are also fighting the gentrification in Chinatown. But CAV that we work with approached us and said, you know, we're really good at canvassing, we're really good at organizing and, you know, bringing out folks for protesting, but we really want to work with the tenants and residents and folks in our organization, and oftentimes monolingual Chinese speakers, to sort of amplify their stories. And more importantly is to demystify the art making process. Because I think for a lot of working class folks, like my parents, like working class folks where I grew up, art is a great luxury, right? It's like, yeah, something you do for fun in high school, but you don't really do that seriously. Right. Like that's not a serious thing for most immigrant or working class folks. And even for me, my parents only finally got what I was doing more recently, and I'm, you know, not a spring chicken. So all that to say that I think it took a lot of convincing, but CAB had this vision of really embracing creative actions and cultural organizing into their work. So they actually approached us. So it was tenants and organizers approached us and said, we want to integrate this into our work. And then we designed the workshops with them. I mean, to be quite honest, we developed the curriculum first, and they were like, no way, this is too heady, too theoretical. You need to like ground it in people, starting with getting their interest. And so we started with story circles, mapping. It was very visceral, you know, very heartfelt sharing. And then from there was the building blocks. And so it was actually their idea to do projections, because we actually didn't have necessarily projections in mind. And then we collaborated with the Illuminator, which is a group that does an activist group that does projections. And then they were like, why don't we actually map out people's stories, not only of resilience, meaning places that are no longer there because now they're like a gallery or a condo, you know, 120 galleries basically that have replaced mom and pop places. But they also said, you know, we want to also map out places of resistance, places where people are still fighting and living, and it's the location or that store, the tenants are still there. So that, you know, as we worked together, to be honest, it was quite organic, which social practice, I hate, you know, I hate that's that word, whatever. It is what it is. I call community-based art making. It is always really messy because you start off with one thing and it completely became something else. Yes. And so that's an example where literally throughout the sort of year that, you know, we're still working with them, through that first intensive year, the project evolved and changed. And then it became, you know, hey, we want to, you know, make art and we want to make banners and signs together to show up at hearings, right? And so we did do that, and we work with Art Against Displacement. I told you a lot of the more community-minded galleries started their own group, and so we would collaborate with them and say, okay, where are the places that we can intersect and actually where can they be allies, you know, in the fight. And so we asked them to make signs, right? And that kind of thing, which is the more traditional. But for us, we wanted to go way beyond that. And so a lot of these tenants started to see themselves, I'm not saying all of them, I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture, but a lot of them saw themselves as cultural producers and like understanding that their story is like so powerful. They're their own experts. And they have the solutions themselves in this work. And so it was important to not just tell the stories, but to also push forward this larger plan that folks in the community were putting forth, which is the Chinatown Working Group Plan, which would protect Chinatown. This larger plan that they were trying to get passed, which is still on the table. I mean,
on the table.
Yeah, on the table, sort of.
Thank you very much. It's really validating to hear you. I just want to say too, in response, is that it's very validating because I feel so often we're working in isolation as teachers. And I'm really grateful again to the Academy for even having this class and this discussion, because especially as teachers where we have so many demands on top of us, and then trying to create art, you're just like inundated and buried. And this is such a breath of fresh air for students, for the community, for teachers. So I really, really appreciate everything you're bringing to this group. Thank you very, very much.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. All right, Pearl, jump in.
Okay, first of all, I'm just raising my hand because Fred told me how to do it with my version. So lower hand. Okay, I have a question, Betty, about how you navigate with different projects with different communities. If you've been called like maybe too close, like you can't be objective because you're too close to the community or you're part of it, or you're too far, maybe you could be objective, but it's not yours to talk about. I'm thinking about last week when we were having a lot of information with like how to teach after the insurrection. And I saw this one website where it was for white teachers teaching white students, for white teachers teaching Black students, for Black students, you know, with a Black teacher, but there was nothing for Asians. So I was just thinking, okay, I don't count, but maybe that could be a place of power where you could be having some unexpected support or someone that's kind of like not like taking a side. So that's just my question, just like with different projects and you're kind of giving voice to different communities.
Yeah. So just to point out, I appreciate that question. That's a really great question. I'll just say outright, I'm not objective. So I'm not a journalist. I think that even journalism, I would hope that all of us understand and know that there's no such thing as objectivity. Even in the edit or the photograph I take or anything I present, even if I'm presenting both sides, it's the way I'm presenting it, right? And so I don't want to be seen as someone who is objective, actually, because the only reason why I use art and culture and installation and all the different mediums I work with as tools is to actually put forth a perspective. And oftentimes it's to counter, the mainstream already has, the mainstream corporate media already is a mouthpiece for and I'm speaking even to the liberal democratic framework or perspective, right? The Nancy Pelosi's and things, right? So how do I offer a more left perspective of folks on the grassroots that don't have that kind of platform, people who are directly impacted by these issues? And so I say that because, I easily could have, interviewed people from Industry City. I easily could have interviewed the Chinese developers from China who are gentrifying my neighborhood of Sunset Park, but I feel like they have that mouthpiece. They've got the corporate media, they've got all of that. So there's no need for me to do that. And that's not my role. And my role is to really elevate people's voices. And so, yeah, definitely there's been criticism that, been called all kinds of names, especially Chinatown Art Brigade, the work that we've done, which has, really, we've ruffled some feathers in the art world and in the community-based organizing world, right? Like, who are you to say something, who are, you don't even live here. Some of us live there, some of us don't. And then other people will say, well, you're too removed. You need to be really in the front lines of it to really understand the impact. And so there's always these various sort of criticisms that I get and that as a collective that we get. And I think that for us, we are always reminded of our principal role, which is to really collaborate and be accountable to the folks that we're collaborating with. So in Sunset Park, even though I collaborate with individuals and also groups, a lot of the, what that meant for a lot of the individuals is checking in with them and making sure they're okay with some of the sensitive information being shared. Like some of them were undocumented, for instance. Some of them were living in illegal housing, meaning a basement or something like that. Was that okay for that to be shared? So just a sense of like accountability can look really like, you know, obviously like much bigger, right? Checking in with community members that are, you know, an organization, or it can look like it could be much more narrow, right? Like working with an individual. But in those cases, I think that my sense of accountability, or my sense of collaboration, is always understanding that, you know, just because you show the other side, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily what's the word I'm looking for? Necessarily speaking truth to power. Speaking truth to power is actually uplifting those that are completely marginalized and under the stories that are undertold. So that, and I want to give a shout out to Kathy Dang, who I will also maybe email this to Renee if folks are interested. I totally agree with you. Asian American voices are completely absent from just right now in organizing, where we are, you know, 18 Million Rising is an organization that you might know of, right? We are, you know, a growing populace, yet for some reason, our voices don't count, right? But Kathy Dang, who used to be the ED of CAB, of the organization I was referencing, is starting a whole national project, which is actually, you know, how to shift, how to talk to the conservative Asian American community, because there's a growing, rising right in the Asian community. So it's about creating materials multilingual to challenge that. And how do you have those conversations with your parents that are maybe Trump supporters or just far right, but they're liberal on other issues. So it's a mixed bag. But anyway, you know, Kathy Dang is working with a number of organizations nationally to develop these toolkits to be able to talk to people and elevate our voices, our progressive voices. So.
Fantastic. Well, we have nearly reached the end of our time today, which is really a bummer, but such is the clock. And so I'd like to take a few moments, if we can, before we thank Betty for this just rich conversation today, to just think ahead a little bit about our third session next week. Betty has prepared, and I'll be sending it to you immediately after this class ends, kind of a template that has questions that you will want to think about if you are able to do a project of some kind with your own students. So our goal for next week is to have you come to the class with a one-page description of a project that you'd like to try to undertake with your students and how you will do that, so that we can put you in small groups and really focus in those small groups on how to make this project happen. What are the steps by which one can do it? What are the kinds of ways we might be able to express some of these ideas? What are some of the hitches we might run across? With the hope that by using that brilliant hive mind that you guys all have, you'll be able to really flesh out some ideas that you'd like to try out with your students. And in doing so, hopefully what our big goal is to come back at the end of the spring and celebrate projects that you have been able to achieve, and have Betty come back with us to take a look at these projects, talk about them, and talk about the meaning they had in your communities. So we know that a week isn't a lot of time, especially because there is a lot of brainstorming with your students that you'll need to do. But to think about the kinds of directions you might like to take a project, how long you think you can dedicate to it, the kinds of directions you'd like to go, and that we can use those for small group conversations in our meeting next week. And Betty, before we end, is there anything you'd like to add to that description that might help teachers think about what happens between now and next week?
Yeah, I would just say, you know, I I know there's so much, I wish we had like so much more time to discuss together, because I know there's so much wisdom and expertise here. You all are also, you know, in the front lines working with folks who are impacted by all these issues, right? Around gentrification, policing, you know, economic injustice, all these things, immigration. So you all know your students very well. And Cecile Chong, who retired, and the clip that I showed of her, she was really inspiring because she gave me a different perspective as a teacher who has been teaching there for over 15 years at that point, and what she has seen, and the knowledge that she holds and you all hold as teachers. She got very choked up in the interview when she was talking about various students who had to move away because of displacement. And, you know, she becomes really attached to them. She became really attached to them. All that to say that to trust your gut as you're collaborating with your students. And I would really just emphasize, as Hagera says so beautifully and eloquently, it's really about the process, not so much the product. Even the process of talking together with your students about what you could create together is so meaningful, right? It could result maybe in something that you brainstorm, but it doesn't come to fruition, right? If there was more time, I would have, I'll send you links, but you know, some of the exercises we did with the tenants that I've done with my students, where you're doing a collective mapping exercise, right? Or even story circles where people are sharing and holding, you know, confidentiality, keeping that in mind, of course. That in itself is the cultural organizing. That in itself is a social practice of creating that together, and just remaining, just the process over product is always what I tell myself, that that in itself, and challenging us to kind of honor that more and more than this capitalist society that trains us to produce and produce and produce something. It might be little short clips that people do on their phones, right? That you end up, you know, creating a collective piece, you know? But I'm happy to definitely, I know you all are meeting on your own next week, you know, but I'm happy to, you know, dialogue over email or whatever it is, honestly, because I, you know, as a teacher myself, you know, my husband's a teacher as well, so a public school teacher. So I very much think that you guys are heroes and sheroes. And so anything I can do to be of support, I definitely want to be there. But I'm really excited the conversations that you will be having, especially this time with your students. It's gonna be quite interesting, I'm sure, what you guys come up with.
Fantastic. Well, we'll have to wrap up things for this evening. So I want to thank you, Betty, very much for being here, for sharing your work, for giving us so much to think about in the days and weeks ahead. And I want to thank you all, you wonderful teachers. It's great to see you all. And I'm really excited to see you again next week and to brainstorm with you about where your heads are at right now and where you might take them with your students. So with that, I hope everybody has a really wonderful evening and a wonderful next couple of days. Don't spend too much time listening to debates of our great elected officials, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye, everybody. Great
Thank
to be
you
with
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
You.
Have a good night. Bye-bye. Thank you.
You too. Bye-bye.